and of prosperity, or will we let unelected bureaucrats and foreign competitors write the rules for us? And I'm here today to say loud and clear, with President Trump, crypto finally has a champion and an ally in the White House. In our administration, we understand the full potential of the digital assets industry, not just as an investment, not just as a flashy technology, but as a symbol and driver of personal liberty for all our citizens. And we are dedicated to seeing that promise fulfilled. The way that we see it, the people in this room are the digital pioneers of the American economy. And that's why our administration is doing something a little unusual in Washington. We're listening to all of you as you blaze the trail of innovation. The innovators in this room are making people's lives better. You're pushing boundaries and solving problems, injecting unprecedented transparency into how we do commerce. And the way we see it, you all deserve a similar level of transparency and clarity. And most of all, you deserve respect and support from your government, not bureaucrats trying to tear you down. Now that means a few substantive concrete steps, and of course the first and most important of those steps is straightforward. We've got to clean up the wreckage that the last administration left us, and since day one that is exactly what we've been trying to do. Our administration, we prioritized eliminating the rules, the red tape, and the lawfare that we saw aimed at crypto by our predecessors. We're ending the weaponization of federal regulations against this community. To put it simply, Operation Choke Point 2.0 is dead, and it's not coming back under the Trump administration. And by the way, it's crazy that was ever even controversial, the idea of using the regulatory power of the government to crush an industry and to crush people who espoused a view that you didn't like. It's crazy, but let my words today serve as Operation Choke Point. Let me serve as its obituary. Now this is my vow to every single person here. You will never see this administration trying to handicap your community or diminish the impact it's had on the economy. Instead, we reject the Biden administration's legacy of death by 1,000 enforcement actions. We reject regulators. Maybe the most important thing that we did for this community, we reject regulators and we fired Gary Gensler, and we're going to fire everybody like him. And we know that people like Gary Gensler, the game that they played is that under the pretense of consumer protection, they attacked every single effort to democratize our financial markets, and that is over. America. I grew up in a working class family. I believe that America is a place where anyone should be able to make a fortune, no matter where you grew up, what degree you may or may not have. And in recent years, I'm hard-pressed to think of a better place to do so than right here in the digital assets industry. Now, our second substantive step is we're trying to create a clear, pro-growth legal framework for stablecoins in this country. And I know we've got some solid allies in Congress. Is Cynthia Loomis out there today, or did she already go home? Well, you know, I was supposed to have dinner last night with Cynthia Loomis. We had a little event yesterday, and I looked around, I said, where the hell is Cynthia Loomis? And somebody said, well, she's got a dinner she had to go to. And I said, I'm the vice president. Unless she's having dinner with the president, Cynthia does not have an excuse to skip this event. But we love Cynthia, and I know that she's one of the great advocates for your industry in the United States Congress. Now, I know, led by Cynthia and other great legislators, Congress is hard at work getting the Genius Act passed and across the president's desk as quickly as possible. And that's an important step. It's with good reason, because regulatory uncertainty in this country has pushed way too much stablecoin activity overseas over the last few years. Now, somebody said to me yesterday that Bitcoin has done so much over the last few years with so many headwinds. Wouldn't it be nice to have a government that provided some tailwinds to one of the fastest growing industries in our country? And that's what we aim to do. And once the Genius Act is enacted, it's poised to vastly expand the use of stable coins as a digital payment system for millions of our fellow Americans. It'll also protect coin holders and inject further transparency into the market. And let me be emphatic on one other point. In this administration, we do not think that stablecoins threaten the integrity of the United States dollar. Quite the opposite. In fact, we view them as a force multiplier of our economic might. Dollar-pegged stablecoins, particularly once Genius is enacted, is only going to help the American economy, and it's only going to help the American dollar. So, again, we're optimistic that the Senate is able to move quickly on passing a clean Genius Act, and for the House to follow up and do the same. And of course, once that happens, our great President Trump will sign it into law the minute it comes across his desk. Now, when that's happened, when the administration will then fully shift to our third priority, which is to enact a transparent and tailored regulatory framework for digital assets, one that's pro-innovation and fully incorporates crypto into the mainstream economy. And again, I've talked to so many of you over the last couple of days, and the consistent fear that I hear with all the great things that have happened over the last couple of months, the consistent fear that I hear is that there's still this perception that digital assets are not welcome in the mainstream economy. And let me promise you that our effort to change the policy is purely about changing that. We want our fellow Americans to know that crypto and digital assets, and particularly Bitcoin, are part of the mainstream economy and are here to stay. Now, we think the way to do that legislatively, because again, I hope that our party is in charge for a long time, but nothing is ever guaranteed in politics. So the best way to ensure that crypto is part of the mainstream economy is through a market structure bill that champions and doesn't restrict the extraordinary value that Bitcoin and other digital assets represent. Right now, in this Congress and with this administration, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to unleash innovation and use it to improve the lives of countless American citizens. But if we fail to create regulatory clarity now, we risk chasing this $3 trillion industry offshore in search of a friendlier jurisdiction, and President Trump is going to fight to make sure that does not happen. Think about this. By locking in smart, pro-innovation rules of the road, we can also make sure that Democrats or anybody else never wage another war on the crypto community. Now, I've already hit my time here, but before I head back to Washington, let me offer you just a few bits of advice and a few thoughts on where this industry is going. This is one politician's perspective, so take it for what it's worth. Maybe a little bit less than one Bitcoin right now. But let me say a few things. First of all, I remember when I ran for Senate the first time I'd ever entered politics back in 2022. And one of the frustrations, honestly, that I had with the crypto community as a person who was one of the only people running for office who actually owned Bitcoin, and I still own a fair amount of Bitcoin today. Think about this. This is during that campaign. That's 2021 and 2022. This feels like an eternity ago, but it was only 4 years ago, is that I recognized what so many advocates of Bitcoin recognize, which is what the Biden administration was doing. What Gary Gensler was doing was a disaster, and yet there didn't seem to be any real organization pushing back against it at the political level. And let me say that part of the reason that I'm standing here, part of the reason that Bernie Moreno defeated Sherrod Brown in the Senate campaign last year is because you guys got organized and got involved in American politics, and I'm grateful to you for that. But there's a lesson to take from that experience, which is that unless you guys get involved in politics, politics is going to ignore this industry. Now, you took a big step in 2024, and I tell you, every victory that we win, it's only a provisional victory. You know, one of my great mentors in Silicon Valley always told me that, Bitcoin, that the crypto community was about exit and artificial intelligence was about voice. Well, I know that a lot of people in 2024 in this community chose voice. You chose to speak up and you chose to get involved, and I believe you changed the direct trajectory of our country because of it. But you got to keep on choosing voice. Bitcoin, of course, people call it digital gold. But while Bitcoin is digital, none of you are. None of us are. What happens in the world of politics, what happens in the world of bureaucracy, it will affect even the most transformational and valuable technologies if we don't make the right decisions. So the first piece of advice, the first thing that I'd ask you is to take the momentum of your political involvement in 2024 and carry it forward to 2026 and beyond. Don't ignore politics, because I guarantee you, my friends, politics is not going to ignore this community, not now and not in the future. The second thing that I want to toss out there is that we have to start thinking of the long-term strategic implications of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is owned by about 50 million Americans. A lot of Americans have made a lot of money, have created a lot of wealth for themselves, and that's a great thing. But I actually think that where Bitcoin is going is as a strategically important asset for the United States over the next decade. It's one of the reasons why President Trump, with the help of our great AI guy, David Sachs, it's one of the reasons why we started the Bitcoin Reserve, because we want to start to put in motion the strategic importance of Bitcoin for the United States government. We know that the PRC doesn't like Bitcoin. The People's Republic of China doesn't like Bitcoin. Well, we should be asking ourselves, why is that? Why is our biggest adversary such an opponent of Bitcoin? And if the Communist Republic of China is leaning away from Bitcoin, then maybe the United States ought to be leaning into Bitcoin, and that's one of the things that we're going to be doing. But that's not a vice president standing up here and talking at you. The way that Bitcoin is involved in the strategic future of our country, that's got to be a two-way conversation. And so when I talk about getting involved in politics, one of the things that you guys got to do is continue to give us feedback and continue to tell us the ways in which Bitcoin can play a positive role in the strategic future of this country. I know the Bitcoin Policy Institute is working on this very topic now, but all of you have got to be involved in this conversation, because I don't think any of us want to wake up in a country 10 years from now that is less wealthy and less prosperous because we made bad decisions today. We're going to make the right decisions, but that depends on you guys being part of the conversation. So be part of that conversation. And here's the third thought that I want to leave you with. You know, one of the ways you hear this stated is that crypto is fundamentally a conservative or right-leaning technology, and artificial intelligence is fundamentally a left-leaning or a communist technology. Now, I think that overstates things a little bit in both directions, but there's a fundamental element of truth to it. Now, I haven't been involved in the day-to-day operations of a technology company in about 4 years since I entered politics for the very first time. But what I've noticed is that very smart right-wing people in tech tend to be attracted to Bitcoin and crypto, and very smart left-leaning people in tech tend to be more attracted to AI. Again, that's a gross generalization, it's an overstatement, but there's an element of truth to it. But what I'd ask you all is to remember that what happens in AI is very much going to affect, in good and bad ways, what happens to Bitcoin. And of course, what happens to Bitcoin is very much going to affect what happens in AI. So, while this is certainly a Bitcoin conference, and I know we're all proud of what you guys have accomplished over the last 10 years, my final piece of advice is to make sure you're keeping tabs on and staying involved in what's happening with artificial intelligence, because I don't want Bitcoin to be negatively affected by what happens in AI, and most importantly, I don't want America to be negatively affected by what happens in AI. And the best way to ensure that smart people are at the AI conversation is to ensure that Bitcoin is part of the artificial intelligence conversation. Our administration is committed to it. I want you guys to be committed to it as well. I just want to say in the next few years in the Trump administration, we've accomplished a lot, but we have plans to continue to make big progress for this industry and for the American people who rely on it. The whole of government, we're going to need your help, we're going to need your guidance, we're going to need your encouragement, and at times, yes, because this is politics, our politicians are going to need your pressure. So, have fun this week, but keep the pressure up. And we'll do great things together for our industry, but most importantly, for the cause of personal freedom and the United States of America. God bless you guys, and thanks for having me.
Testing 1 2. Ah, why is that? Testing 1 2 3. 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 Yeah. You want me to test it? Testing 1 2 3. Testing. Okay. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Mic check 1 2 3. No? Yeah? Good. How's that? You want me to keep talking? I can keep talking. Testing 1 2 3. Yeah. Mic check. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Mic check. Everybody okay? Yeah? Okay. See? No? Meh?
Testing, 1, 2. Testing, testing. Testing, 1, 2. Check, check. Testing, 1, 2. Testing. 1, 2, 1, 2. Testing. 1, 2, 1, 2. Testing. Testing, testing, 1, 2, testing. Testing, 1, 2, testing. Testing, 1, 2, check. Testing, 1, 2, check, check, check. Testing, 1, 2, check. It'll be 5 minutes. I'm sorry. The family's upstairs. They're coming down. So thanks for your patience. We'll get started in 1 minute. 5 minutes. Sorry about that. can have the family walk around. They'll be joining us. It'll be easier. Testing, testing. Sound good? Cool. Okay. Yeah, stand over on the sides here. Yeah, she can.
Good morning. Thank you for your patience. Can you hear me just fine? Uh-oh. Cute. Who's going to sit here? Oscar? Can you sit? Oh, you can move. Okay, ready? Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. Good morning. Thank you to members of the press for being here today as we uplift the story of our client, Sophia Via. I'd also like to acknowledge our additional speakers, Sophia's mother, Daisy Vargas, and another one of her attorneys, Rebecca Brown, as well as our colleagues who are here with us from Morrison and Forrester. My name is Gina Amato, and I'm the directing attorney of the Immigrants' Rights Project here at Public Counsel. Public Counsel is a nonprofit law firm, and our mission is to fight for civil rights, economic, and racial justice. Our client, Sophia Via, is a 4-year-old little girl from Mexico who is Sophia Via is a pseudonym that we're using to protect her privacy. She is here in the United States with her parents on humanitarian parole to seek life-saving medical treatment. Sophia suffers from short bowel syndrome, which prevents her from being able to take in and process nutrients on her own. She requires very specialized medical care that requires her to undergo IV treatments 14 hours a day in her home. This treatment cannot be administered outside of the United States, so it's imperative that she remains here. Sophia and her parents presented themselves at the border in July 2023, seeking humanitarian parole for the purpose of getting medical treatment for their child. She has been undergoing treatment at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and while Sophia's condition has improved, she cannot live independently without that treatment. On April 11th, Sophia's mother, Daisy, received a notice from the Immigration Service letting her know that their humanitarian parole would be revoked and that the work permits of the parents would be canceled. They received a subsequent notice weeks later and a third notice in May, verifying that they are no longer in lawful status and are now vulnerable to deportation. The notices also ordered the family to leave the United States immediately. If deported and removed from accessing her specialized medical care, Sophia's doctors have been clear that she will die within days. Deporting this family under these conditions is not only unlawful, it constitutes a moral failure that violates the basic tenets of humanity and decency. I will now welcome Daisy, Sophia's mother, to the mic. Thank you. Oh, excuse me. First, we're going to do a Spanish language translation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm the translator. Hi, everyone. My name is Gina Amato. Hello. Sorry. Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es Gina Amato. Gracias a todos ustedes por venir aquí. Quiero también darle las gracias a las personas adicionales, a Daisy, a la abogada Rebecca Brown, también a las oficinas de Morrison Forrester. Nosotros somos una organización llamada Public Council. Estamos aquí peleando para los derechos civiles. Para empezar, nuestra cliente Sophia Via, ese es un nombre que estamos usando para proteger su privacidad. Es una niña inocente de 4 años de México que le dieron el parón humanitario, una forma de autorización para estar aquí en los Estados Unidos hace 2 años, en julio 2023, para recibir tratamiento para salvarle la vida aquí en los Estados Unidos. Ella sufre de una condición llamada síndrome del intestino corto y depende de recibir el tratamiento médico para sobrevivir. Este tratamiento no será administrado seguramente afuera de los Estados Unidos. El 11 de abril, la mamá de Sofía recibió una notificación terminando el parón humanitario con instrucciones para irse de los Estados Unidos. Recibieron una segunda noticia semanas después, cancelando sus permisos de trabajo y reiterando la revocación del parón humanitario, poniendo a riesgo a la familia de deportación. Si fuera deportada y removida de su acceso al cuidado médico, los doctores de Sofía han sido muy claros que ella morirá en unos pocos días. Deportando a esta familia bajo estas condiciones no solo es ilegal, constituye una falla moral que viola los principios básicos de humanidad y decencia. Ahora queremos introducir a Daisy al micrófono.
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es Daisy Vargas. Soy mamá de Sofía. En 2023, mi hija y yo recibimos un permiso humanitario que hasta ahora le ha salvado la vida. Mi hija nació con síndrome de intestino corto y depende de un sistema especializado para sobrevivir. Debido a esta condición, tengo que conectarla a sondas gástricas 4 veces al día. Es un proceso que dura 1 hora. Mi hija está conectada 14 horas cada noche solo para sobrevivir. Cuando vivíamos en México, mi hija no crecía ni se mejoraba. Ahora, con la ayuda que ha recibido en los Estados Unidos, mi hija tiene la oportunidad de salir del hospital, conocer el mundo y vivir como una niña de su edad. En los últimos meses recibimos cartas de inmigración cancelando nuestro permiso humanitario y mi permiso de trabajo. En las cartas nos dicen que corremos el riesgo de ser deportados y que lo mejor para nosotros es irnos. Los médicos de mi hija nos dicen que los pacientes como mi hija no pueden salir del país porque no hay los mismos recursos médicos en otros países que en los Estados Unidos. Si nos deportan y le quitan a mi hija el acceso a su sistema especializado, ella morirá. Gracias.
Hello, good morning. My name is Daisy. In 2023, my daughter and I received a humanitarian parole that up until today has saved her life. My daughter was born with a syndrome in the intestines, and she needs specialized care to survive. Due to this condition, I have to connect her to gastric tubes many times throughout the day, up to 4 times throughout the day, a process that can take many hours. My daughter is connected 14 hours every night just to survive. When we lived in Mexico, my daughter, she did not get any better. Now, with the help that she has received in the United States, my daughter has an opportunity to get out of the hospital, know the world, and live like a normal girl of 4 years. In the last few months, we've received letters from immigration canceling our humanitarian parole and my work permit. In these letters, they tell us that we run the risk of being deported, and the best thing that we should do is to leave. The doctors of my daughter has told us that patients like her cannot leave the country because they won't have the same medical recourses that other places have, like in the United States. They deport us and they remove my daughter from her specialized medical care. She will die.
Good morning. My name is Rebecca Brown, and I'm Sophia's lawyer. Humanitarian parole is for people like Daisy and Sophia. Daisy did everything she was asked to do to save her child's life. She applied to enter the United States to get better treatment for her daughter and waited until that application was granted before coming here. All that Daisy wants is for her child to continue to receive the amazing care that Sophia is getting at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. According to Sophia's medical team, sending Sophia to Mexico before that treatment can be concluded means Sophia will die, possibly within days. Had anyone taken the time to conduct an individualized assessment of my client's case, we are confident that they would clearly see the humanitarian need. Either the government did not conduct an individualized assessment, which is required by law, or they made the cruel decision to send Sophia in harm's way. We truly hope that the administration will recognize the medical need here and grant humanitarian parole to this deserving family. This administration's policy of trying to eradicate parole is cruel and nonsensical. It's impacting countless individuals who are in the United States for various life-saving reasons. Meeting humanitarian needs isn't political. It is the right thing to do. Parole exists to protect the most vulnerable, like Sophia, and this case is a reflection of it. This administration is moving quickly and broadly. Children are being swept up in the fallout. This is a crisis that can and should be avoided. We remain hopeful that the decision makers will do the right thing and allow our client Sophia to stay in the United States to receive the life-saving care that she urgently needs. Thank you.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Rebecca Brown y soy la abogada de la familia. El paro humanitario son para niños y parientes como Daisy y Sofía. Daisy hizo todo lo que ella le pidieron de hacer para salvar la vida de su hija. Ella aplicó para entrar a los Estados Unidos para recibir mejor tratamiento para su hija y esperó hasta que la aplicación fuera aprobada antes de llegar a los Estados Unidos. Lo único que Daisy quiere es para que su hija continúe recibiendo el cuidado médico que ella está recibiendo en Children's Hospital. De acuerdo al equipo médico de Sofía, mandando a Sofía a México antes de que ese tratamiento se concluya, indica que Sofía pueda morir. en unos pocos días. Si alguien hubiera tomado el tiempo para tomar una evaluación individual del caso de mi cliente, nosotros estamos seguros que ellos hubieran visto lo que se necesita, que es humanitario. O el gobierno tal vez no hizo esa evaluación individual que es requerido por ley, o hicieron esa decisión cruel para mandar a Sofía de regreso a su país de origen. Nosotros esperamos que el gobierno reconozca el cuidado médico que ella necesita aquí y que le den el parol humanitario a esta familia. Esta póliza de la administración que está tratando de erradicar el parol es muy cruel. Está impactando vidas, muchas vidas que están aquí en los Estados Unidos por muchas razones, tal vez hasta por ayudarlos. El parol humanitario no es algo político, es algo necesario que se debe de hacer. El parol existe para proteger a los más vulnerables y este caso es un reflejo de eso. Esta administración está moviéndose muy rápido y los niños son los que están afectados. Esa es una crisis que debería de ser evitada. Nosotros mantenemos la fe de que las personas que están tomando las decisiones van a hacer la cosa correcta para dejar que nuestro cliente permanezca en los Estados Unidos para que reciba el tratamiento que ella necesita.
So in short, Sophia's case is a symbol of the recklessness of this administration's deportation policies. To suddenly yank away that welcome mat, take away Sophia's life-saving care, and quite literally risk her life is a cruel betrayal of our nation's word and an affront to our shared humanity. This case is heartbreaking, no doubt, but it's not unique. For so many people fleeing violence, persecution, or who are dealing with life-threatening illnesses, deportation is a death sentence. From asylum seekers sent back to danger to individuals deported to authoritarian regimes like El Salvador's CCOT prison, we're seeing a pattern of cruelty and a violation of our most treasured rights and values. These are people coming to us for protection, and instead, we're sending them to die. That's not justice, and it doesn't make us any safer. We cannot let our country turn its back on this child, or frankly, on any of our immigrant neighbors who are simply fighting for a better life, safety, and the right to due process and justice. So raise your voice, share Sophia's story far and wide, and demand that our leaders do the right thing.
Para terminar, para concluir, el caso de Sofía es una símbolo de la imprudencia de esta administración, de las pólizas de deportación de esta administración, para de repente quitarle algo que le está ayudando la vida, el cuidado médico a Sofía y arriesgándole la vida, es un tratamiento muy cruel. Este caso es muy triste, pero no es el único caso igual. Para muchas personas escapando violencia, persecución o tal vez con condiciones médicas, deportación básicamente es una sentencia de muerte. Como las personas pidiendo asilo regresándolos al lugar donde están huyendo, o individuales deportados como a lugares como el CICOT de El Salvador, estamos mirando que están haciendo como algo cruel y una violación de nuestros derechos. Estas personas están viniendo aquí para protección y más bien nosotros estamos mandándolos para que se mueran. Eso no es justicia y no nos hacen más seguros. No podemos dejar que nuestro país tome la vuelta a la vida de una niña, o más bien a todos los inmigrantes que siempre están peleando para tener una vida mejor, peleando para tener seguridad y peleando para tener sus derechos. Alten sus voces, comparten la historia de Sofía, demanden que nuestros líderes hagan la cosa derecha.
And now we'll take some questions from the press. Yeah.
Michelle Bias with NBC4. Has the Trump administration been advised or notified by your team? And if so, do you know if they are aware of the case?
Absolutely. We wrote to them soon after we received the case. We did our best to give them the benefit of the doubt and let them know that we think they made an error, that we have a 4-year-old child whose life is in danger, and we asked them to reconsider their decision to terminate humanitarian parole. We have not heard anything back. We subsequently filed new applications for humanitarian parole and similarly have not received a response. Yes.
I have two questions. The first is, can you clarify a little bit the treatment? I'm not totally clear if it's an IV or feeding tube or both, and explain why this can only be administered in the United States and not in 100% any other country, or just particularly in Mexico. And the second question is if Daisy can share anything that Sophia has been doing and enjoying here in this country that she was unable to do while she was hospitalized.
Sure. So my understanding is that she receives nutrition intravenously as well as nutrition through a feeding tube. The treatment is not available outside of the United States because the equipment cannot be taken outside of the U.S. The manufacturer, do you want to explain a little bit more?
Sure. And she has her equipment on her back. It's the little backpack that she's wearing. So it has to bypass the digestive system because she cannot take it in through her digestive system. And the manufacturer, per the manufacturer, it cannot travel. So it has to stay here. And the equipment is administered by Children's Hospital Los Angeles. So.
And prior to coming to the United States, she was in the hospital. So this treatment actually allows her to leave the hospital, live life at home with her parents.
Yeah.
Sure.
No sé si, buenos días, si podría explicarnos un poquito más. Usted dijo que Sofía pudo salir del hospital con el dedo a Estados Unidos. ¿Puede decirnos un poco más de cómo se ve ahora? ¿Cuáles son las cosas que más disfruta, que más le está haciendo, que no pudo disfrutar?
Yes. ¿Puede usted?
Sí, Sofía pudo salir del hospital y ella disfruta mucho pasear, ir al parque, supermercado. Son cosas que durante 3 años que estuvo hospitalizada consecutivamente no hacía y es algo muy nuevo para ella. Incluso hay muchísimas cosas más por hacer que aún no conoce. De Oaxaca, de la costa.
Just wait for her. Wait, sorry. If we could just wait for the translation. Yeah.
So, Sophia likes to enjoy many things. She likes to travel. She likes to go to the supermarket. Things that she just normally wouldn't have been able to do during the consecutive years that she was hospitalized. And there's so much more that she will continue to enjoy doing.
Daisy, ¿cómo pudieron traer a la niña originalmente de México si requieren tratamientos que tienen que estar con ella a todo tiempo?
Tuvimos que traerla conectada, así llegamos a la frontera, a Tijuana, con nutrición parenteral y con... en México dicen suero, que es para hidratar, no sé cómo es el nombre acá, pero así trajimos a Sofía.
No sé si la madre puede platicar un poco de cómo se siente, cómo ha vivido este momento, los sentimientos después de que recibieron esta orden de salir.
Do you remember what she said?
I kind of wrote down. To answer the previous question, so in order to bring Sophia over, we needed to bring her connected, and she had to be hooked up to, in Mexico, it's called suero. I'm not sure what it's called here.
¿Puede compartirnos un poco cómo se ha sentido desde que le dieron esta orden de salir del país?
Son muchísimos sentimientos porque debido a mi situación no tenía como la manera de resolver esta situación por mí misma. Sentí mucha impotencia y es mucha intranquilidad porque dependo totalmente el parole para el tratamiento que Sofía necesita y del permiso de trabajo para solventar sus gastos.
I have many feelings due to my situation. I felt helpless. I didn't have a way of resolving this issue on my own. I relied completely on the humanitarian parole that I had, and as well as the work permit.
Daisy, Ross Morley from Point Break News in Bakersfield. Can you tell us a little bit about how your family came to Bakersfield and what your daughter enjoys about her life there?
Fuimos trasladados del hospital de Los Ángeles y lo que más disfruto es ver a Salomé en un lugar que no sea el hospital, porque estuvo así consecutivamente 3 años, día y noche sin salir, y era de verdad muy triste ver a Salomé en una cama 24 horas conectada.
So we were transferred from the Los Angeles hospital. That's how we arrived to Bakersfield. And what I enjoy most is seeing Sophia just outside of the hospital and living her life.
Una duda, ¿ella está ahora en Bakersfield o aquí en Los Ángeles? ¿Dónde recibe el tratamiento?
Recibo el tratamiento en casa, pero el hospital que la atiende es el hospital de Los Ángeles, el hospital infantil en Bakersfield. Sí.
Sorry, can I translate? So my daughter receives at-home treatment, and she in Los Angeles, but I live in Bakersfield.
Pregunta, al llegar aquí a California, ¿cómo se pudieron conectar con el hospital de Children's de Los Ángeles? ¿Cómo fueron esas primeras visitas a este hospital?
Sí. Llegamos a Tijuana, a la frontera. Migración directamente nos trajo al hospital de San Diego, al Ready Children's, para asegurarse que Salomé estuviera bien. Ahí estuvimos durante 1 año. El hospital de San Diego nos trasladó a Los Ángeles para que ellos pudieran organizar su alta.
We got to the border in Tijuana. We were then sent to the San Diego hospital, and then we were transferred to Los Angeles hospital.
Disculpa, ¿le han dado alguna fecha específica o es una autodeportación cuando ustedes lo deciden?
Ya han cancelado el parol humanitario, entonces ya están fuera del estatus y les dijeron que tienen que salir del país inmediatamente.
¿Cuándo entregaron ustedes la carta al gobierno de Trump y el seguimiento a eso para que trataran de frenar la deportación y renovar el humanitarian parole?
¿Cuándo mandamos el papel? Al principio de mayo, ¿verdad? Al principio de mayo mandamos una carta al Servicio de Inmigración diciéndolos que habían hecho un error, que habían cancelado el parol humanitario de esta niña, pero que está muy enferma y que no puede salir del país. Dentro de unos días, como la próxima semana, metimos las aplicaciones nuevas para renovar su estatus. Unas semanas después, pues siguió mandando noticias el Servicio de Inmigración confirmando que habían cancelado el estatus y los permisos y que ellos tienen que salir del país. Entonces, pues han mandado las noticias después de recibir la correspondencia de nosotros.
¿Cuál es el consejo que les da la abogada a ellos para que estén tranquilos, para que pues se han quedado sin estatus? Y entonces me imagino que es una gran intranquilidad. ¿Qué les dice la abogada a ellos? ¿Cómo se pueden preparar o proteger?
Okay, do we want to be translating every question, every answer?
Yeah, I think just her. No.
Oh, just translate what she's saying.
Entonces, lo que estamos diciendo, su equipo de abogados, es que estamos haciendo todo posible. No hay ninguna garantía, ¿verdad? Tenemos que ser honestos de eso. No hay ninguna garantía, pero estamos haciendo todo posible para ayudar a la familia para que se puedan quedar aquí y la nena puede continuar a recibir su tratamiento médico.
With the family living in Bakersfield, have you reached out to Congressman Vince Vaughn or Congressman David Valadao, who represent Kern County, to intervene on behalf of the child?
I don't believe we have reached out to those particular public figures, but we have reached out to others who have been helpful in our advocacy, and I will follow up with those individuals. Thank you.
Is there any legal precedents where the court has stepped in to prevent these types of deportations from happening? Second part to the question, do doctors believe that Sophia could one day survive without any medical treatment, such as the care that she's getting here in LA?
Yes, the goal of Children's Hospital Los Angeles is to always treat their patients so that their intestines can become rehabilitated and they can discontinue treatment. They have said that her condition has improved substantially, but that she is not at the point where she can survive on her own, and they don't have a specific timeline as to when that will be. Whether or not there is precedent, we are seeing all kinds of court cases trying to prevent the unlawful removal of individuals. Some have been successful and others have not. Sí. Sí. Sí, solo dice, las noticias solo dicen que hemos cancelado su parol humanitario y sus permisos de trabajo y tienen que salir del país. No dan una razón específica. También nosotros sabemos que hay mucha gente en este país que ha recibido ese tipo de noticia, incluso una abogada en mi equipo que es nacida aquí en los Estados Unidos. Pero esta noticia es un poco diferente porque dice específicamente parol humanitario. Ellos saben que tienen parol humanitario y lo están cancelando, pero no dan ninguna otra razón por esa decisión.
Quisiera preguntarle a Daisy si ella tiene miedo y qué significaría si regresa a México.
Si tiene miedo, ¿y qué pasaría si regresa a México?
Sí tengo miedo porque nuevamente Sofía corre riesgo de morir si no recibe el tratamiento tan solo en un par de horas. ¿Qué pasaría si regresamos a México? Sofía volvería a estar hospitalizada día y noche debido a que allá no hay los recursos para que ella pueda hacer su vida normal como en casa.
I am very scared because Sophia runs the risk of not receiving the treatment that she requires for her condition. And if we return back to our country, she would be at the hospital day and night.
Ante tal situación que su hija está en riesgo de perder la vida, ¿ha pensado quizás en esconderse, en quedarse en Estados Unidos? O sea, todo por salvar a su pequeña hija.
¿Se ha pensado en esconderse? No, dice que están aquí enfrente de todos tratando de seguir el sistema legal, hacer los pasos correctos y hacer pues todo autorizado por el gobierno. No han pensado en esconderse.
De una forma distinta, ella cumpliría con la orden de deportación o de autodeportarse.
Primero va a hacer todo posible, porque ella sabe que en este caso deportación es una sentencia de muerte. Entonces, no tiene planes de salir del país, va a continuar luchando y haciendo todo posible para que se puedan quedar. Yes.
¿Puede explicar un poquito más del tratamiento? ¿Es continuo o es en la noche las 14 horas? ¿Y cada cuánto tiempo tiene que recibir alguna ayuda del hospital?
Te quería explicar.
Sí, ella es conectada durante 14 horas por la noche intravenosa y durante el día 4 veces. Esto del día es a través del G-tube y dura 1 hora, pero 4 veces al día. Lo que tiene en la mochila son las 14 horas, que es algo que le llaman TPN, nutrición parenteral en español, y esa es por 14 horas.
¿Ella puede alimentarse normal?
Por boca sí.
¿Qué le sostiene usted la esperanza? ¿Es usted una persona de fe? No sé si usted ora o le reza a Dios que por parte de su hija, ¿qué es lo que le sostiene usted todos los días?
La fe, claro. Sí creo demasiado en Dios y durante este tiempo Él ha hecho muchas maravillas en la vida de Salomé.
Is this treatment so advanced that it is not... Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So initially, Sophia's connected 14 hours at night. During the day, it's 4 times. It's a gastral tube, which lasts for 1 hour. What she's wearing on her backpack is part of the 14-hour treatment that she has to receive. But she's still able to intake food. And the second part, other question, I have a lot of faith. I believe in God, and He has already blessed us with many miracles.
Is it because that is state-of-the-art treatment that this is not provided in, say, Mexico City, which is very advanced? Is it because of the manufacturer not being able to travel with that backpack? Have you guys explored options in places like Mexico City?
Yes, so Children's Hospital Los Angeles has a world-class program for it's an intestinal rehabilitation program, so it's a very specialized program. My understanding is that there are about 200 children being treated in that program, and the manufacturer of the equipment that delivers the intravenous nutrition is not available outside of the United States. The manufacturer will not allow the equipment to travel outside of the United States, and that is why the treatment is not available outside of the U.S.
Daisy, ¿qué te gustaría decirle a la gente que te mandó esa carta? ¿Qué te gustaría responderle a esa carta que te han mandado en la que te cancelan tu parol humanitario?
Que consideraran la situación de Salomé. Por favor.
Just to consider the situation of my daughter, please.
I have a question. I'm just curious what you're saying to your daughter, how you're even explaining being here in front of all this press, what those conversations are like.
She says she doesn't really know how to respond. She told me prior to the conference that Sophia doesn't understand much of what's going on. She's 4, so her comprehension is limited. We are going to start wrapping up the press conference. I'll let you know that Daisy is available for individual interviews. If you are interested, you can speak with Faith Holland from Rise Strategy Group. We will do our best to accommodate everybody's request. We are very grateful for your presence and for your thoughtful questions and for your effort in uplifting this story. Thank you so much for being here today. Do you want to?
Yeah. If you want to have an interview,
Sophia.
Let me just set up a little corner, then we can just have people.
Daisy, Daisy, can you hold the girl so we can take a picture with her?
¿Quiere que la cargue?
Sí, sí, la puedo.
¡Yeah! ¡Qué chula! She's
little corner. We're going to set up a little corner over here for everyone to have one-on-one interviews, but we do ask that we do have limited time, so we do ask that you keep your interview short to about 3 minutes. And we'll just set up a little corner if everyone can just kind of line up, and then we can just do the interviews one-on-one.
Are we writing out the ones that we want to, how is going to?
I think if you can just stand in, if we can just all kind of get in line, and then I'm going to set up a little corner over here so that we can. Thank you.
Yo creo que para que no se cansen, termina por el problema.
Daisy, ¿te podemos hacer una entrevista en español rápido? Aquí varios medios.
Wait, can you, we're going to take him up to...
Okay, can you all hold on one second, let the family go
Just
upstairs.
let the, with the daughter go upstairs.
She's tired.
I'm not talking to them, I'm just still. Okay. We are, yeah, but we just want to do it in an orderly process, so it's not overwhelming.
We're going to go back in.
Sophia.
Okay. Vamos a tomar entrevistas ahí.
With your camera. Yeah. Fun with it. But yeah, so that's the nice thing with these cameras. You can also switch to straight down. And so when you upload it to your, when you like plug your card into your computer, when you open the files, those photos will be under the side.
And then, are we going to translate for... No,